Midnight. A candle gutters in a stone chamber with no windows. Somewhere above, water laps against marble steps. A hand, pale, ringed, trembling only slightly, presses a wax seal into a folded letter. No name is written on it, only a number. 3 men in black robes sit around a table shaped like a horseshoe, their faces half swallowed by shadow. None of them look at each other. None of them need to, because in this room, eye contact is a kind of confession. Somewhere in the city above, a man is about to be arrested for a crime he has not yet committed, but will, according to the letter now drying on the table, be found guilty of by morning. He does not know it yet. He is asleep beside his wife. He is dreaming of nothing in particular. This is Venice. Not the Venice of gondolas and golden light. Not the Venice sold to tourists in postcards centuries from now, but the other Venice. The Venice beneath the Venice. A republic that called itself a republic and ruled itself like an empire of fear. The men in this room have no crowns. No armies march at their command in daylight. And yet for 400 years, nothing happened in this city, no war declared. No ambassador received, no husband executed. No priest exiled, without first passing through their hands. They called themselves the Council of 10. The people called them something else. In whispers, when they thought no one was listening. The stone lion outside the Doge's palace has a mouth. A slot carved into marble, shaped like a snarl, built for one purpose only. To swallow the names of the accused. By morning, the letter will be inside it. And a man asleep beside his wife will wake up already condemned. To understand the council. You must first understand the city that made it necessary, and the city, in the early 14th century, was already drowning in its own suspicion. Venice was not a kingdom. It had no bloodline of kings, no divine right passed from father to son. It was, on paper, something rarer and stranger, a republic of merchants, built not on land but on water, its wealth drawn not from soil but from salt, silk, spice, and the endless traffic of ships moving between east and west. The city had no walls in the way other cities had walls. It did not need them. The lagoon itself was the fortress, shallow, treacherous, riddled with sandbars that only a Venetian pilot could navigate. An invading fleet could sit within sight of the bell towers and never find a way in. But a city that fears no army from outside will always, eventually, begin to fear the enemy within. Picture it. Narrow canals slick with algae and rot. The smell of tar from the shipyards mixing with brine and rotting fish along the docks. Bells ringing at all hours. For mass, for curfew, for warning. Masked figures moving through fog-choked alleys, long before Carnival made the mask a costume. Here, the mask was already a way of life, a tool of anonymity in a city where everyone always was being watched by someone. Venice had grown rich beyond imagination. Its ships controlled trade routes stretching from the ports of Alexandria to the markets of Constantinople. Its merchant families held fortunes that dwarfed those of foreign kings. And where there is that much wealth concentrated in the hands of ambitious men, there is always inevitably the temptation to seize more. By 1310, that temptation had already produced a conspiracy. A nobleman named Bahamonte Tiepolo, furious at being excluded from power, marched armed men into the city square itself, attempting to overthrow the government by force in broad daylight. The coup failed, barely. And it left the ruling class of Venice with a wound that never fully closed, a permanent, knowing fear that the next conspiracy might not fail, that the next traitor might be smarter, quieter, closer to the throne of power than anyone expected. The city's leaders faced a question with no comfortable answer. How do you protect a republic from its own citizens without becoming the very tyranny you claim to prevent? Their answer was to build a machine so secretive, So absolute, so terrifyingly efficient, that no one, not nobleman, not priest, not Doge himself, would ever again dare to test its reach. They called it temporary. A committee of 10 men granted extraordinary powers to investigate the conspiracy. Meant to dissolve once the crisis passed dot, it never dissolved. For nearly 500 years. It grew instead, quietly, patiently, like something rooted in the foundations of the city itself. Impossible to remove without bringing the whole structure down with it. At first, it seems almost reasonable. 10 men, elected, not inherited, serving terms of only 1 year, so that no single individual could accumulate too much personal power. On paper, it looks like the opposite of tyranny, a safeguard against exactly the kind of one-man rule that had nearly toppled the Republic. But look closer. Look at what those 10 men were actually permitted to do. They could summon any citizen of Venice, noble or common, priest or merchant, to answer questions in a closed room, with no lawyer present, no public record kept, no appeal available afterward. They could authorize torture, quietly, efficiently, in chambers built specifically for that purpose. Tucked beneath the very palace were foreign ambassadors, were received in silk and velvet just floors above, could order an execution, and have it carried out within hours, sometimes between the hours. Setting of one sun and the rising of the next, with no trial the public would ever see, no verdict the public would ever read, and they could do all of this while remaining, by law, almost entirely unaccountable to anyone outside their own circle. This was the genius of the system and its horror. The Council of 10 was never truly 10 men. It was 10 men plus the Doge, the ceremonial head of the Republic, plus 6 additional advisors, called the Savi, bringing the working number closer to 17. But even that understates the machine's true reach, because beneath the council sat something even more chilling in its ordinariness: the mouths, stone faces built into walls across the city, the most famous. Outside the Doge's own palace, each carved with a slot for, slipping in a folded denunciation: Bocca di Leone, lions' mouths. A citizen with a grievance against a neighbor, a rival merchant, an unfaithful spouse, a business partner who owed them money, needed only ink, paper, and the cover of night. No signature required, no evidence demanded, only a name and an accusation. Historians still argue about how many of these anonymous denunciations were ever acted upon versus quietly filed away and ignored. The surviving records suggest the council was, in fact, more discerning than popular legend claims, dismissing the majority of unsubstantiated tips. But the truth of how the system functioned mattered far less than the fear of how it might function, because the not knowing was the point. A husband who suspected his wife of infidelity did not need to prove it. He only needed to write it down, fold the letter, and walk it to the wall in the dark. And every citizen of Venice, walking past that carved stone face on their way to market, understood one thing with perfect clarity: someone might be writing your name into that mouth right now. Fear does not require constant enforcement. It only requires the possibility of it, repeated often enough for long enough, that the possibility becomes indistinguishable from certainty. Venice had built a government that ran, in part, on the imagination of its own citizens. The council did not remain a wartime emergency measure for long. Within decades, its powers expanded far beyond the original mandate to investigate treason, reaching into espionage, foreign policy, even the private conduct of the Doge himself. Consider the case of Marino Faliero. He had spent a lifetime in service to the Republic, a soldier, a diplomat, a man who had commanded fleets and negotiated with foreign courts. Finally elected Doge in old age as a reward for decades of loyalty. It should have been the crowning honor of his life. Instead, it destroyed him. The details, as they survive, describe a man humiliated at a public banquet, a young nobleman scrawling an insult about the Doge's much younger wife. An insult so crude that when Faliero demanded punishment, the Council of Ten instead handed down a sentence he considered a mockery. A slap on the wrist for a nobleman who had disgraced him in front of the entire city. Something in him broke. What happened next reads like the darkest kind of tragedy. An old man, already at the summit of power he had spent a lifetime climbing toward, deciding that summit was not enough. Faliero began plotting with a small circle of conspirators to seize absolute control of the city, to tear down the very council system that had insulted him, and rule Venice not as an elected figurehead, but as an outright prince. The plot was betrayed before it could unfold. One conspirator, perhaps overcome by conscience or fear, warned a friend not to leave his house on the appointed night. The friend went instead to the authorities. Within hours, the machine that Faliero himself had once served began turning against him. He was arrested in his own palace, tried in a closed chamber by the very council whose limited powers had wounded his pride in the first place. And on the 17th of April, 1355, Marino Faliero, Doge of Venice, commander of fleets, servant of the Republic for 60 years, was led to the same staircase where new Doges were traditionally crowned, and beheaded upon it his portrait, painted alongside every other Doge in the great hall of the palace, was ordered removed. In its place, a black shroud, and an inscription recording only that this space had once belonged to a man executed for his crimes. Then everything changed, because after Faliero, the lesson was no longer theoretical. It was carved into stone, painted in black, hung in the very hall where every future Doge would walk before taking office. Reach too far. The empty frame seemed to whisper, and this is what remains of you. Not a name, not a legacy, only an absence, and a warning. The Council of Ten had proven something no army ever could, that even the highest office in the Republic was not above their reach. That power in Venice did not flow upward toward a single throne. It pooled instead in a windowless room, among men whose names the public barely knew. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what came next. Because once a government proves to itself that it can execute even its own head of state without consequence, there is very little left that it will hesitate to do. By the 16th century, the Council of Ten had become something closer to the true sovereign power of Venice than the Doge, the Senate, or any other body the Republic officially recognized. Foreign ambassadors, arriving in the city with letters of introduction and gifts for the Doge, quickly learned that the real negotiations happened elsewhere, in closed sessions where the council weighed matters of war, trade, and espionage with a coldness that startled even hardened diplomats from Rome and Paris. The council maintained its own network of spies stretching across the Mediterranean, paid informants in foreign courts, intercepted correspondence, decoded secret ciphers. It functioned, in modern terms, as intelligence agency, secret police, and Supreme Court, all fused into a single, unaccountable body. Its reach extended into matters that other governments would have considered far too intimate for state involvement. Marriages between noble families were scrutinized for political implications. Business dealings with foreign merchants were monitored for the leaking of state secrets, particularly the closely guarded techniques of Venetian glassmaking, so valuable that craftsmen who fled the city to sell their knowledge abroad could be marked for assassination. Yes, assassination. Sanctioned, documented, paid. 4. The council maintained what amounted to a covert execution budget, authorizing the killing of Venetian citizens who had betrayed state secrets to foreign powers, even when those citizens had fled far beyond the reach of Venetian law. Agents were dispatched to Vienna, to Rome, to the courts of the Ottoman Sultan, carrying poison, blades, or simply patience, waiting months or years for the right moment to the outside world. Venice presented herself as the Serenissima, the most serene republic, a jewel of art and commerce and civic order, admired by visitors for the beauty of her palaces and the sophistication of her laws. But beneath that serenity ran a current of absolute ruthlessness, and the men who maintained it understood something that few rulers before or since have grasped so completely: that true power does not announce itself. It does not sit on a throne wearing a crown for all to see. It sits in a windowless room, wears no distinguishing mark, and lets the crown wearer above it believe he is the one in control. The Doge wore the ceremonial horned cap. The Doge received foreign dignitaries in gilded halls. The Doge's face appeared on coins minted in the city's name, but the Doge could be executed on his own staircase if the council decided he had overstepped. And every Doge who followed Faliero understood this with perfect, permanent clarity. This was the peak, not a moment of triumphant expansion, but a state of quiet, total control so complete that it rarely needed to exercise its most extreme powers at all. Fear, once thoroughly planted, tends to water itself, but absolute power, even when wielded in secrecy, exacts a price from those who hold it, and the Council of Ten was not immune. Consider what it meant to serve on this body. A term of only 1 year by design, so that no single councillor could entrench himself in permanent authority. And yet, within that single year, a man was asked to sit in judgment over neighbors, cousins, in-laws, sometimes his own former friends, to authorize torture in chambers he might pass walking to dinner, to sign execution orders for men whose wives he had danced with at weddings the year before. The psychological weight of this arrangement rarely appears in the official records, because the records themselves were built to erase psychology entirely, to reduce every human being who passed through that chamber to a case number, a verdict, a sentence carried out. But traces survive. Counselors who resigned early, citing illness that seems, on closer reading, to resemble something closer to a breakdown of conscience. Family lines that quietly withdrew from public service for a generation after a relative's term on the council, never fully explaining why. And there is the matter of the prisons themselves, beneath the Doge's palace, and connected to it by a covered bridge that visitors today photograph for its beauty, without always learning its purpose, sat cells built into the very stone foundation, the posse, the wells, so named because prisoners were lowered into chambers that flooded with lagoon water at high tide, the walls sweating damp and cold regardless of season. Above them, under the lead-sheeted roof, sat another set of cells, the Piobi, unbearably hot in summer, where a young Giacomo Casanova would later be imprisoned and, in one of the few successful escapes in the prison's history, would claw his way out through the very roof meant to contain him. Between the palace and these prisons ran the covered walkway, now called the Bridge of Sighs, a name given centuries later by romantic poets, imagining the sound condemned prisoners made as they crossed it, catching a final glimpse of the lagoon and the sky through its small stone windows before disappearing into darkness. The bridge is beautiful. Tourists photograph it by the thousands every year, rarely pausing to consider what its beauty was built to disguise. This was the hidden cost of the machine, not only the suffering inflicted on the accused, though that suffering was real and often severe, but the moral erosion required to sustain such a system decade after decade, generation after generation. A ruling class that had to teach itself, again and again, to look at a neighbor and see a potential traitor, to read a private letter and see evidence, to hear a rumor and treat it as truth, because the alternative, trusting, forgiving, waiting for proof, felt to men convinced their republic hung by a thread. Like a luxury they could not afford. The real horror came later, when the machine built to protect the republic from conspiracy began, almost imperceptibly, to manufacture the very paranoia it claimed only to police. Neighbors settled old grudges through anonymous denunciation. Business rivals eliminated competition with a folded letter and a lie. The lion's mouth did not distinguish between a genuine trader and a jealous merchant with a grudge. It only swallowed names. And the machine behind it, however discerning it tried to be, could never fully separate justice from vengeance dressed in justice's clothing. Power, sustained this long, this completely, does not remain clean. It cannot. The Council of Ten did not merely punish corruption in Venice. In its own quiet way. Over centuries, it became a kind of corruption itself, necessary, perhaps in its origins, but never again willing to loosen its grip once it had tasted how total that grip could be. For nearly 500 years, the machine held. Empires rose and fractured around it. The Byzantine world it had once traded with collapsed into Ottoman hands. The balance of Mediterranean power shifted again and again, and still, the Council of Ten endured, adapting, tightening, surviving. But even the most perfectly engineered fear cannot outlast the world that gave it purpose. By the late 18th century, Venice was no longer the maritime superpower it had once been. The great trade routes that had built its fortune had shifted with the age of exploration, as Atlantic powers, Spain, Portugal, later England and the Netherlands, opened ocean routes to Asia and the New World that made the old Mediterranean spice trade far less central to European wealth. The republic that had once commanded fear across the sea now found itself a fading relic, rich in art and architecture, poor in the raw military and economic power that had once made its secret police necessary and terrifying in equal measure. And beyond its shrinking borders, a new kind of empire was rising, one built not on secrecy but on cannon fire, marching under the banner of a general who had already humbled half the crowned heads of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte did not fear the Council of Ten. He barely acknowledged it existed as a serious obstacle at all. In the spring of 1797, French forces stood at the edge of Venetian territory, and the government that had once executed its own Doge for overreaching now found itself paralyzed, unable to decide whether to fight, negotiate, or simply hope the storm would pass them by, as it always somehow had before. The machine built to detect internal betrayal had no defense against an external force that did not care about denunciations, anonymous letters, or windowless chambers. Canons do not read confessions. On the 12th of May, 1797, the Great Council of Venice, the body from which the Ten had always technically drawn their authority, voted to dissolve the Republic's own government rather than face the humiliation of conquest. Depending on which account one credits, the vote passed with barely a functioning quorum present, many members having already fled the city in the preceding days. A republic that had survived doges, conspiracies, plagues, wars, and nearly 5 centuries of its own internal machinery of fear ended not in a final battle, not in a dramatic siege, but in a half-empty room voting itself out of existence because resistance no longer seemed to serve anyone's interest. The Council of Ten, the body that had once held the power of life and death over every citizen of the Republic, simply ceased to convene. No formal execution, no dramatic arrest. It did not fall to an uprising of the people it had terrorized for centuries. It fell, in the end, almost quietly, dissolved along with everything else, because the empire it had spent 500 years protecting from enemies within had finally been undone by an enemy from without that it had never been designed to face. The empire survived in memory. The machine did not, somewhere in the Doge's palace. In a room most visitors walk past without a second glance. The horseshoe-shaped table still sits where it always sat. No records survive of any final meeting. No dramatic last session. No farewell address. No ceremonial burning of denunciation letters. The council simply stopped. The way a clock stops when no one remembers to wind it. What became of the thousands of documents it had accumulated over 5 centuries? The confessions extracted in torture chambers beneath the palace. The anonymous letters dropped into stone lion mouths. The coded reports from spies in foreign courts is itself a matter of historical dispute. Some were preserved, later catalogued by archivists fascinated by the machinery of a vanished secret state. Others, historians believe, were destroyed in the chaos of the Republic's final days, deliberately burned by men who understood exactly how damning their contents might prove to be. Once there was no longer a government powerful enough to protect them from the consequences of what they had authorized. We will likely never know how many names were swallowed by that stone mouth and never spoken of again. We will never know how many of those denunciations were true, and how many were simply the final act of a jealous husband, a bitter rival, a neighbor with an old and unhealed grudge. The mystery is not a failure of the historical record. It is, in its own way, the entire point. A government built on secrecy does not simply become transparent because it ceases to exist. Its silence outlives it. Return now to that candle in the windowless room, to the hand pressing wax into a folded letter, to the man asleep beside his wife, dreaming of nothing in particular, unaware that his fate has already been decided by 3 faces he will likely never see. That scene played out, in some form, for nearly 500 years. In a city the world remembers today for its beauty rather than its fear, for painted ceilings and glass, beads and canals photographed by travelers, who rarely learn what happened in the rooms just above the water they glide across. The Council of 10 was born from a single failed coup, a moment of genuine and reasonable fear that the Republic might not survive its own ambitious men. In that sense, its founding was not irrational. Every republic, every empire, every fragile system of shared power must eventually answer the same question. How do you defend a government from betrayal without becoming a betrayer of the very freedoms you claim to protect? Venice answered that question by building a machine so secretive, so unaccountable, so total in its reach, that it outlived the empire it was built to protect by not one day. It did not fall because it was defeated by the enemies it hunted within. It fell only when an enemy arrived that its methods were never designed to face, because fear, however perfectly engineered, cannot stop a cannon. Perhaps that is the warning worth carrying out of this story. More than any single execution, any stone mouth, any bridge built to hide the sound of a prisoner's final breath, power that survives by making people afraid of one another does not, in the end, make an empire strong. It only makes an empire brittle, beautiful on the surface, hollow beneath, capable of standing for centuries, right up until the moment something arrives from outside that was never afraid of it at all. Somewhere in that palace, the horseshoe table still waits in the dark. No one sits there now, but the silence it left behind has never quite gone away.